Hook, I trapped my brother's voice in this calabash to save his life. Now, the atmospheric pressure is rising, and the wind is starting to scream his secrets. On today's episode of the Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity in Douala usually felt like a wet wool blanket, but tonight, inside Nanda's 12th floor penthouse, the air was unnervingly crisp, stripped of its weight by the rhythmic incantations she had spent a fortune to learn. On the obsidian kitchen island, amidst a sea of blueprints and half-empty espresso cups, sat a calabash that looked older than the city itself, its surface etched with the geometric precision of the Bamileke kings. Nanda's hands, usually steady enough to draft the skeletal structures of stadiums, trembled as she held the beeswax candle. Beside her, Tala sat perfectly still, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, heartbreaking trust. He had been a journalist for only 3 years, yet he had unearthed a truth that the big men in the capital intended to bury along with his body. He had come to her not for a hiding place, but for a miracle, and Nanda in her hubris had reached into the archives of their lineage to find a solution that the modern world had forgotten. The ritual required no blood, only the vibration of a final chosen word. She watched the flame dance in the reflection of Tala's pupils, the silence between them thick with the unsaid. "Once it is done, you will be safe," she whispered, her voice cracking against the sterile, air-conditioned chill. "They cannot kill a man who has no testimony. They cannot torture a secret out of a throat that holds nothing but breath." Tala opened his mouth to protest, but the wax was already dripping, and the pull of the calabash was beginning to manifest as a low-frequency hum that made the very marrow in her bones ache. The moment the wax sealed the mouth of the gourd, the world seemed to turn inside out. The roar of the Douala traffic, the honking of yellow taxis, the distant thrum of generator engines, the melodic shouting of street vendors, suddenly vanished, replaced by a vacuum so absolute it felt like a physical blow to the eardrums. Tala's final word, a plea or perhaps her name, was sucked into the dark aperture of the calabash with a sound like a collapsing star. He didn't scream. He couldn't. Instead, his body jerked backward, his features softening, his edges becoming blurred as if he were a photograph left out in the rain. Nanda lunged for him, but her hands passed through his shoulder as if he were made of smoke and fine silt. He was there, yet he was elsewhere, a physical presence that lacked the anchor of identity. The calabash, now heavy as lead, pulsed with a dim, sickly light beneath the hardened wax. Outside, the palm fronds on the balcony began to thrash violently, though there was no storm on the horizon. A sudden, localized gust of wind slammed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, howling with a tonal quality that was disturbingly melodic. It wasn't the sound of nature. It was the sound of a human chord, stretched across the sky and distorted by the pressure of the atmosphere. Nanda clutched the calabash to her chest, feeling the frantic, muffled heartbeat of her brother's voice trapped within the wood, while the wind outside began to scream the very secrets she had tried to hide. The dawn that followed was a pale, sickly gray, filtering through the smog of the city and illuminating a room that felt fundamentally broken. Tala was still there, sitting on the designer sofa where she had left him, but he looked like a sketch of a man that someone had forgotten to finish. He could move, he could blink, and he could even eat the papaya Nanda placed before him with shaking hands, but there was no weight to his presence. When he walked across the polished hardwood floors, there was no sound of footsteps, only the faint, whistling sigh of air rushing to fill the space he had just occupied. Nanda watched him from the kitchen, the calabash now hidden inside a padded camera bag she kept slung over her shoulder. She felt a gnawing, acidic guilt in her stomach. She had sought to protect his life, but she had inadvertently deleted his essence. Every time she tried to catch his eye, Tala looked through her, his gaze fixed on the windows where the wind continued to circle the building like a predatory bird. The silence was no longer a sanctuary. It was a museum of her failure. She checked her phone, seeing dozens of missed calls from Tala's editor, and even more from numbers she didn't recognize. The men with low voices and long shadows who were undoubtedly wondering why their primary target had suddenly vanished from every digital and physical grid in Cameroon. By noon, the atmospheric anomaly had worsened, drawing the attention of the neighbors and the local news. The wind was no longer just a breeze. It was a focused, intelligent entity that seemed to react to Nanda's every movement. When she stepped onto her balcony to catch her breath, the air pressure dropped so sharply her nose began to bleed, and a voice, Tala's voice but amplified to a deafening, ethereal roar, rushed past her ears. It wasn't speaking words yet, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was the rhythm of his anger, the staccato of his fear. Inside the apartment, the calabash began to sweat a dark, aromatic resin that smelled of ancient forests and burnt sugar. Nanda realized with a jolt of horror that the wind wasn't just a byproduct of the ritual, it was the overflow. The gourd was too small to hold the entirety of a man's truth, and the excess was leaking into the world, seeking a way back to the hollow shell of the man sitting on her sofa. Tala stood up then, his movements fluid and ghostly, and pointed a translucent finger toward the bag on her shoulder. He couldn't speak, but his eyes were screaming. He knew that what she had done was worse than death. She had turned him into a haunting. As the wind began to rattle the heavy glass doors of the penthouse, Nanda realized that the safety she had promised was a lie. She hadn't silenced the truth. She had merely given it wings, and now the very air of the city was beginning to turn against her. The glass-walled offices of Nanda and partners sat perched above the Douala skyline like a diamond in the rough, a testament to Nanda's rise as the city's most formidable architect. But today, the sleek lines of her drafting table and the minimalist aesthetic of the studio felt like a cage. She sat at her workstation, the leather camera bag containing the calabash resting heavily against her ankles, while her team buzzed around her discussing the new stadium project in Garwa. The air conditioning was humming at its usual clinical rhythm, yet Nanda could feel a localized pressure building around her desk. It started as a subtle ruffling of blueprints, a gentle agitation of the paper that seemed independent of the vents. Then, the temperature spiked. It wasn't the humid heat of the coast, but a dry, friction-heavy warmth that smelled of ozone and sun-scorched earth. Her lead designer, a sharp-eyed woman named Elise, walked over with a tablet, but as she opened her mouth to speak, a sudden, violent draft swept through the open-plan office. It wasn't just a wind. It was a targeted surge of air that knocked the tablet from Elise's hand and sent 1,000 sheets of tracing paper spiraling into the air like white birds. In the center of the chaos, Nanda heard it, a sharp, aspirated hiss that sounded exactly like the first syllable of the name of the Minister of Mines, the very man Tala had been investigating. The sound didn't come from the room. It came from the void created by the wind. The panic in the office was immediate and sharp. Colleagues scrambled to grab flying documents, their voices rising in a cacophony of confusion, but Nanda remained frozen, her eyes fixed on the way the wind seemed to coil around her chair like a serpentine familiar. It wasn't just noise. It was a structured leak. The wind was carrying Tala's unspoken research, the dangerous data she thought she had successfully quarantined. As the draft subsided, leaving the office in a state of disarray, the air began to vibrate with a low, rhythmic thrum, the cadence of a broadcast. Elise looked at Nanda, her face pale, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" It sounded like someone was whispering about the offshore accounts. Nanda felt a cold sweat break across her collarbone. The calabash was failing to contain the sheer volume of Tala's conviction. Her brother had been a man of too many words, too much truth, and now the physical world was reacting to the artificial vacuum she had created. She realized then that she couldn't stay in the city. The density of the population made the leak too dangerous. Every person who stood in her wake was a potential witness to a ghost's testimony. She grabbed the bag, ignored Elise's frantic questions, and bolted for the elevator, the wind following her into the small metallic box and pressing against the doors until the steel groaned under the atmospheric weight of a man's stolen voice. Desperation led Nanda to a part of Douala that didn't appear on the shiny tourism brochures, a district where the skyscrapers gave way to low-slung concrete bunkers, and the smell of diesel was tempered by the scent of drying herbs and salt water. She sought Mba, a man known in certain circles as a cultural auditor. Mba didn't wear robes or brandish flywhisks. He sat in a room filled with high-end servers, flickering monitors, and jars of mountain soil from the West region. He was the bridge between the digital and the primeval. When Nanda placed the calabash on his desk, Mba didn't touch it. He pulled out a handheld frequency scanner and ran it over the wax seal. The device began to scream, its digital display flickering with error messages as it tried to reconcile the compressed vocal data with the laws of physics. "You haven't just hidden a voice, Nanda," Mba said, his voice a gravelly baritone that seemed to ground the frantic energy in the room. "You've created a sensory paradox. A Bamileke ritual used in a city of 10 million people is like trying to contain a monsoon in a glass bottle. The ancestors designed these seals for the quiet of the highlands, where the trees could absorb the spillover. Here, the concrete reflects it. The glass amplifies it. You aren't protecting him. You're turning him into a signal that everyone can tune into if they just listen to the breeze." Mba began to explain the concept of the ancestral firewall, a method of grounding the energy before it shattered the vessel. He tapped a sequence into his computer, pulling up a topographic map of the Bambautos Mountains. "The calabash is vibrating at a frequency that matches your brother's heart rate, but because he has no voice, his soul is trying to exit through his skin to find the sound you've stolen. If you don't find a way to stabilize the pressure, he will evaporate. He will become nothing but a localized weather pattern." Nanda looked at the screens, seeing the spikes in the air pressure readings around her own GPS coordinates. It was terrifying to see her guilt quantified in decibels and millibars. Mba warned her that the men Tala was running from wouldn't need a wiretap to find him now. They only needed to follow the trail of broken glass and sudden storms. He gave her a small vial of iron filings and mountain salt, telling her to circle Tala's bed with it, but his expression remained grim. The ritual was evolving, feeding on Nanda's own fear. "The wind isn't just answering you because it's a byproduct," Mba whispered as she prepared to leave. "It's answering you because it's hungry for the rest of the story. You gave it the beginning, the voice. Now it wants the ending, the body." Returning to the penthouse was like stepping into a tomb that refused to stay quiet. Tala was sitting by the window, his form so translucent that Nanda could see the outline of the city lights through his chest. He was no longer a man. He was a suggestion of a person, a fatting memory given flesh. She rushed to him, trying to grab his hand, but her fingers felt only a faint, static-charged tingle, like the air before a lightning strike. The silence in the room was now aggressive. It was a physical weight that pressed against her chest, making every breath feel like she was inhaling liquid lead. She frantically began to spread the iron filings and salt in a circle around him, as Mba had instructed, but the moment the circle was closed, the calabash in her bag began to scream. It wasn't a sound that could be heard with the ears. It was a sound that vibrated directly into the skull, a high-pitched frequency that caused the crystal decanters on her bar to explode simultaneously. The shards of glass didn't fall to the floor. They hung suspended in the air, caught in a swirling vortex of invisible force that centered entirely on the calabash. As the glass spun, it began to etch lines into the walls, the very same Bamileke patterns that were carved into the gourd. Nanda realized with horror that the voice was trying to write its way out since it could not speak. The wind outside slammed against the windows with such force that the reinforced glass began to spiderweb. She looked at Tala, hopping for some sign of the brother she knew, but his eyes were vacant, reflecting only the chaotic dance of the glass shards. He was being hollowed out, his identity being sucked into the vacuum of the ritual. Suddenly, the power in the building failed. In the sudden darkness, the only light came from the calabash, which glowed with a rhythmic, pulsing amber. The air in the room became so thin she had to gasp for air, her lungs burning as if she were at the summit of a mountain. "Tala, I'm sorry," she sobbed, the words feeling heavy and useless in the face of the storm. The wind answered her immediately, a gust of air rushing through the cracks in the window and molding itself into the shape of a human face for a fraction of a second, a face that looked like their father's. The static in the air was no longer just noise. It was a presence, an ancient, demanding thing that had realized Nanda was the only one left who could break the seal. Sleep was an impossibility, a luxury for those whose guilt didn't howl at the door. Nanda spent the small hours of the morning huddled on the floor of the balcony, the calabash cradled in her lap like a cursed child. The city below was a sea of amber lights, oblivious to the metaphysical war happening 12 stories up. The wind was different tonight. It was seductive. It had dropped from a roar to a conspiratorial whisper, a draft that felt like a cold finger tracing the line of her jaw. As she closed her eyes for a second, she heard it, a voice that wasn't Tala, but one she hadn't heard in 20 years. "Nanda, my daughter, let the air breathe," the wind sighed. It was the exact tone, the exact inflection of her mother, who had died in the mountain mists of the West region. Nanda's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew it was a trick of the aeromancy, a manipulation of the air currents to mimic the frequencies of her own grief, but the emotional pull was almost physical. The wind promised relief. It promised that if she just cracked the wax seal by a hair's breadth, the pressure would equalize and the ghosts would be laid to rest. She stood up, her hand hovering over the hardened beeswax, her thumb grazing the rough surface of the gourd. The temptation was a living thing. If she opened it, Tala would speak again. He would be solid. He would be real. But she remembered the men in the black SUVs who had been idling outside her office that afternoon. To give Tala his voice was to give him his death warrant. The wind sensed her hesitation and changed its tactic. The gentle whisper turned into a harsh, mocking laugh, a sound that combined Tala's youthful tenor with the dry rattle of a dying man. The palm trees below thrashed in a sudden, violent spasm, their fronds pointing toward the north, toward the highlands. It was a command. The city was rejecting the ritual. The modern world had no place for this kind of weight. Nanda looked back into the darkened apartment at the glowing, semi-transparent silhouette of her brother. He was staring at her, his head tilted in a way that suggested he was listening to the same whispers. She realized then that the wind wasn't just talking to her. It was calling him home. The balcony felt like it was tilting, the gravity of the ritual pulling her toward the edge, until she retreated inside and locked the doors, the sound of her mother's voice screaming her name through the glass until the sun began to rise. By the 7th day, the silence had become a commodity that people were willing to kill for. Nanda's phone was no longer ringing with work queries. It was buzzing with encrypted messages from anonymous sources. The wind's leaks at the office had reached the ears of the very men Tala had been investigating. They didn't understand the ritual, but they understood that Nanda was the keeper of a secret that was literally in the air. As she attempted to leave her apartment building, she was intercepted in the lobby by 2 men in impeccably tailored suits, the kind of men who worked for the Ministry of Territorial Administration. They didn't threaten her with weapons. They threatened her with a quiet, terrifying politeness. "Your brother has been very quiet lately, Mademoiselle Nanda," the taller one said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "But the atmosphere around your family is volatile. We are concerned about the public health risks of such unstable weather." They knew. They didn't need to see the calabash to know she was the source of the anomaly. Nanda felt the wind beginning to stir in the lobby, a low growl of air that rattled the glass displays of African art. She gripped the strap of her bag, her knuckles white. "My brother is away," she said, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. "The weather is just the season changing." The men smiled, a gesture that held no warmth. As they stepped closer, the wind in the lobby suddenly erupted into a localized cyclone. It wasn't a random burst. It was a targeted strike. The air pressure in the lobby spiked so rapidly that the men were forced to their knees, clutching their ears as their eardrums threatened to burst. Nanda watched in a daze as the wind tore the fountain's water from its basin, spinning it into a shimmering, violent veil between her and the agents. In the center of the spray, she saw Tala's face, contorted in a silent scream of rage. The wind was protecting her, but it was doing so with a ferocity that bordered on the demonic. She realized that the currency of silence had a fluctuating exchange rate. She had paid with Tala's voice, and now the world was demanding interest in the form of chaos. She ran for her car, the wind clearing a path through the panicked lobby, realizing that the city was no longer a hiding place. It was a battlefield. The drive from Douala to the West region was a journey through time and elevation. As Nanda's SUV climbed the winding roads of the highlands, the heavy, humid air of the coast was replaced by the sharp, invigorating chill of the mountains. Tala sat in the passenger seat, his form flickering like a bad television signal. Every time they passed a village, the wind would pick up, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and wood smoke into the car, even with the windows rolled up. The calabash in the back seat was silent now, but it felt heavier than ever, a dense knot of spiritual energy that seemed to be drawing the very mountains toward them. Nanda looked at the hills, the chefferies hidden in the folds of the landscape, the ancient stone walls that marked the boundaries of the Bamileke kingdoms. Here, the ritual she had performed wasn't a myth, it was history. She was returning to the source, hoping that the earth of her ancestors could hold what the concrete of the city could not. When they arrived at their family's ancestral compound, a collection of red earth buildings with conical thatched roofs, the air was eerily still. Her uncle, the keeper of the family's oral history, was waiting at the gate. He didn't look at Nanda, he looked at the empty space beside her where Tala should have been. "You brought the storm back to the mountain," he said, his voice a dry whisper that matched the rustle of the maize stalks in the wind. He led them to the central courtyard, where the red dust seemed to glow in the twilight. Nanda felt a profound sense of dread. In the city, the ritual was an anomaly. Here it was a transgression. Her uncle explained that the calabash wasn't just a container, it was a filter. By trapping the voice, she had blocked the flow of the family's breath, the ancestral line of communication that kept the living and the dead in balance. The wind that followed her wasn't just Tala's secrets. It was the frustrated energy of their lineage, trying to force the truth into the open. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the wind began to howl through the valley, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the very ground they stood on. The haunting took a digital turn on their second night in the highlands. Despite the remote location, Nanda's laptop and phone began to behave as if they were possessed. The wind outside wasn't just hitting the walls, it was oscillating at frequencies that mimicked cellular signals. In the middle of the night, the radio in the corner of the room, an old transistor model that hadn't worked in years, suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't playing music or the news. It was broadcasting Tala's voice. "The accounts are held in the name of the Falcon Foundation," the radio hissed through a thick layer of static. "The signatures were forged in October." Nanda scrambled to turn it off, but the volume only increased. It was happening everywhere. In the nearby village, people reported that their phones were playing recordings of a man's voice whenever they moved through a draft. The wind was using the modern infrastructure to bypass the seal of the calabash. It was a ghost in the machine, a literal cloud of data that couldn't be deleted or encrypted. Tala stood in the center of the room, his translucent arms twitching in sync with the radio broadcast. He was becoming a conductor for the energy, his body a mere antenna for the voice he no longer possessed. Nanda realized with a sickening jolt that the truth Tala had discovered was too large for a single vessel. The ritual hadn't just saved his voice, it had amplified it, turning it into a viral entity that was spreading through the airwaves. She watched as a group of villagers gathered outside the compound, their faces lit by the glow of their own phones, listening to the wind speak the secrets of the powerful. The slow build of the mystery was over, the secret was out, but it was detached from the man. Tala was fatting faster now, his physical presence becoming so thin that he was little more than a shimmer in the air. The more the wind spoke, the less of Tala remained. Nanda clutched the calabash, realizing that the ancestral firewall Mba had spoken of was being breached by the very technology she had hoped would hide them. The wind was no longer a protector. It was a broadcaster, and it was using Tala's life force as its battery. In the quiet hours before dawn, Nanda's uncle took her to a hidden cave behind the compound, a place where the air was stagnant and smelled of damp stone. He began to tell her the story she had only heard in fragments, the story of why their father had spent the last 10 years of his life in absolute silence. He didn't lose his voice to a stroke, Nanda, the uncle said, lighting a small torch that threw long, dancing shadows against the cave walls. He traded it, just as you have. He pointed to a shelf carved into the rock, where a row of identical calabashes sat, each sealed with the same dark, ancient wax. Our family has always been the keepers of the unspoken. Whenever a truth was too dangerous for the world, a daughter of our line would seal it away. Your father found a secret about the village's land rights that would have started a war. He chose the silence to save the peace. Nanda felt the world tilt. This wasn't a desperate improvisation she had invented. It was a hereditary curse, a cycle of self-sacrifice that she had unwittingly continued. She realized then that her father hadn't died of a broken heart. He had died because the wind eventually stopped answering him. When the silence becomes too heavy, the person carrying it begins to sink. The difference, her uncle continued, looking at the bag on her shoulder, is that your brother didn't choose this. You chose it for him. You stole his breath to satisfy your own fear of losing him. The revelation was a physical blow. Nanda saw the parallel. She had treated Tala like a project, an architectural problem to be solved with structural supports and clever shielding. She hadn't seen him as a man with a right to his own destiny, even if that destiny led to a martyr's grave. The wind outside the cave began to moan, a sound that carried the weight of generations of silenced men. It wasn't a roar of anger anymore. It was a groan of exhaustion. The breath of the father was a burden that Tala was never meant to carry, and the calabash was beginning to crack under the pressure of a lineage that was tired of being quiet. The physical reality of the ritual reached a breaking point on the 10th day. The calabash, once cold and wooden, began to radiate a heat so intense it charred the interior of the camera bag. Nanda had to place it on a stone pedestal in the center of the courtyard, where it sat poolsing like a miniature sun. The air around it was distorted by heat waves, creating a mirage effect that made the entire compound look like it was underwater. More terrifyingly, the oxygen in the courtyard began to vanish. The wind was now sucking air inward, fueling the compression of the voice inside the gourd. Nanda and her uncle found it difficult to speak, their words falling flat as the air lacked the medium to carry sound. It was a literal pressure cooker of sound and soul, and the safety valves were starting to fail. Tala was now almost entirely invisible, a human-shaped vacuum that moved through the shimmering air. When he brushed against Nanda, she felt a searing heat followed by a bone-chilling cold. The voice, inside the calabash, was trying to recombine with the body, but the wax seal was too strong, creating a metaphysical friction that threatened to ignite. The village was now in a state of alarm. The localized weather had become a storm that never moved, a pillar of wind that reached up into the clouds. Nanda realized that if the calabash shattered now, the release of energy would be catastrophic. It wouldn't just be a voice returning. It would be an explosion of compressed sound that could level the compound. She was trapped in a paradox of her own making. She couldn't open it without risking a lethal discharge, and she couldn't leave it sealed without watching her brother fade into nothingness. The political hunters from the city were forgotten. The only enemy now was the physics of the forbidden. Nanda sat in the dirt of the courtyard, her blueprints spread out around the poolsing calabash. She was an architect, and if she couldn't solve this with ritual, she would solve it with design. She began to sketch a structure, not a building for people, but a building for sound. She used the principles of acoustic resonance she had studied for the Garwa Stadium, but she inverted them. Instead of reflecting sound toward a center, She designed a series of baffles and chambers that would decompress the air in stages. She directed the villagers to move heavy stone slabs and wooden planks according to her precise measurements, creating a labyrinthine wind trap around the stone pedestal. If she was going to break the seal, she had to provide a path for the air to lose its velocity before it reached the world. As she worked, she felt a strange, detached clarity. She was building a cathedral for her brother's voice, a place where his truth could be released without destroying everything she loved. The architecture of wind was a hybrid of Bamileke geometry and modern fluid dynamics. She saw Tala standing at the edge of the construction, his shimmering form watching her with what she hoped was approval. This was her apology, not a hiding place but a stage. She realized that she had spent her life building walls to keep people safe, but a voice needs more than a wall. It needs a resonant chamber. As she placed the final stone, the wind began to channel through the vents she had created, producing a low, haunting melody that sounded like a choir of 1,000 voices. The pressure inside the courtyard began to stabilize, the heat receding into a manageable warmth. She stood before the calabash, a chisel in one hand and a prayer on her lips, ready to face the storm she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The physical evolution of the calabash moved from the realm of the supernatural into something disturbingly biological as the 11th night bled into the 12th. Nanda sat within the stone labyrinth she had constructed, her eyes burning from exhaustion, watching as the once glossy surface of the gourd began to ripple and soften. The transformation was slow, a creeping alteration that replaced the dried, woody texture with a translucent, veined membrane that pulsed in time with an invisible heart. It no longer looked like a ritual object. It looked like a living organ, an externalized lung that was breathing for a man who had forgotten how. The geometric Bamileke carvings didn't disappear. Instead, they became raised, keloid scars on this new, fleshy surface, glowing with a faint, subcutaneous amber light. Nanda reached out, her fingers hovering inches away from the warmth radiating from the vessel, and she felt a sickening jolt of recognition. The skin of the calabash had developed the same small, crescent-shaped birthmark that Tala carried on his left shoulder. It was as if the ritual, starved of a physical anchor, was cannibalizing Tala's biological blueprint to build itself a body. The air in the courtyard was thick with the scent of copper and wet earth, a sensory overload that made Nanda's architectural mind reel. She realized that the container was no longer just holding his voice. It was becoming him, cell by agonizing cell, while the shimmering ghost of her brother stood by, growing more transparent until he was nothing but a ripple in the heat haze. This biological encroachment forced Nanda to confront the horrifying possibility that there would soon be nothing left of Tala to save. The architectural baffles she had built to manage the wind began to vibrate with a new, fleshy resonance, the stone slabs humming not with air, but with the sound of blood rushing through 1,000 tiny valves. She felt a profound sense of cosmic irony. She had sought to preserve her brother by turning him into a secret, yet the secret was now more real than the man himself. Every time the wind whipped through the courtyard, it carried the sound of a heartbeat, a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the soles of her feet. She began to see the logic of the ancestors. A voice is not just sound. It is the vibration of a body, the movement of muscle and bone. By stealing the voice, she had stolen the engine of Tala's existence. She spent the night drafting letters to contacts in Douala, her hands shaking as she typed on a laptop that flickered with static every time the calabash pulsed. She was recording everything: the ritual, the hunters, the truth Tala had found, hoping that if the physical man vanished, his data would survive in the digital cloud, even as his soul was being digested by a piece of mountain fruit. The wind outside the stone labyrinth didn't just howl. It whimpered, a low, guttural sound of a creature in the final stages of a transformation it never asked for. The sky above the Bamileke highlands didn't just turn dark. It turned and bruised, apocalyptic violet as the localized atmospheric anomaly finally reached its peak. The architecture of wind, Nanda had designed was being tested to its absolute limit, the stone slabs groaning under the pressure of a cyclone that had narrowed its focus to a single point, the fleshy, pulsing calabash. From the perspective of a satellite, the storm would have looked like a needle, a perfectly vertical pillar of cloud and lightning that connected the earth of the compound to the ionosphere. Inside the eye of this storm, the air was eerily, terrifyingly still, but it was a stillness charged with enough static electricity to make Nanda's hair stand on end. She stood at the center of her labyrinth, shielded by the baffles, watching as the wind outside the stone walls tore the thatch from the ancestral huts and sent the village's livestock into a frenzy of terror. The sensors she had placed around the courtyard were flatlining, unable to process the sheer density of the air. The wind wasn't just moving, it was screaming, but the scream wasn't coming from the sky, it was coming from the very molecules of the air, a thousand-fold amplification of Tala's suppressed rage. The eye of the storm was a confessional booth of cosmic proportions. As the cyclone roared around them, the air within the labyrinth began to shimmer with projected images, flickering, translucent scenes from Tala's memories that the wind was printing onto the mist. Nanda saw her brother as a child, hiding under a table during the civil unrest. She saw the moment he found the ledger that proved the ministry's corruption. She saw the fear in his eyes when he realized the men in the black SUVs were following him. The wind was unloading the entire cargo of his life, purging the data into the atmosphere because the calabash could no longer hold the weight of his history. Nanda realized that the storm was a bypass. It was the world's way of correcting the vacuum she had created. The ancestors weren't just guardians of tradition, they were the guardians of balance, and they were using the weather to shatter the silence she had imposed. The villagers, huddled in the lower caves, began to chant, a low, rhythmic prayer that synchronized with the thrumming of the calabash. They weren't praying for the storm to stop, they were praying for the truth to be finished. Nanda clutched her blueprints to her chest, feeling the paper begin to disintegrate in the high-pressure environment, realizing that no structure she could build would ever be strong enough to house a man's destiny. In the center of the howling vortex, as the images flickered against the mist, Nanda finally heard the truth that Tala had been trying to tell her, the truth that went beyond the political scandal and the offshore accounts. The wind began to articulate words, not through the transistor radio or the digital static, but through the direct manipulation of her own eardrums. "Nanda," the air whispered, the voice so clear it felt as if Tala was standing directly behind her, his breath warm against her neck. "I didn't run to you to be saved. I ran to you to be heard." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her brother hadn't come to her for a hiding place. He had come to her because she was the only one who could validate his sacrifice. By performing the ritual, she hadn't protected him. She had silenced the very thing he was willing to die for. The wind revealed his final investigation. It wasn't just the Minister of Mines, but their own family's historical involvement in the land-clearing projects that had displaced thousands in the 80s. The wealth that had paid for Nanda's prestigious architecture degree, her penthouse, and her high-flying career was built on the very silence she was now trying to maintain. The unspoken truth was a mirror held up to Nanda's entire existence. She saw the blueprints of her stadiums and skyscrapers through the lens of Tala's research, and she saw the foundations were built on graves. The wind showed her the faces of the families whose land had been stolen, faces that looked like the people in her own village. Tala's voice, vibrating through the stone labyrinth, was a lament for a stolen future. "You built your world on a foundation of wax, sister," the wind sighed, a cold draft that seemed to pierce her very heart. "And now you use the same wax to seal my mouth." The guilt she had been carrying transformed from a vague, protective instinct into a sharp, crystalline clarity. She had been an architect of denial, using her skills to create beautiful shells for a reality that was rotting from within. The calabash, now looking more like a human heart than a gourd, began to leak a dark, ink-like substance, Tala's unspoken testimony, finally manifesting as a physical liquid. Nanda fell to her knees in the red dirt, the ink staining her designer clothes, realizing that the safety she had bought for Tala was actually a cage for herself. She had been hiding his voice to keep her own world from crumbling, and now the wind was tearing it all down to make room for the truth. As the realization of her complicity settled into her bones, the physical toll on Tala became undeniable. He was no longer even a shimmer. He was a literal hole in the air, a vacuum in the shape of a man that sucked the warmth out of everything it touched. Nanda tried to reach out to the space where he stood, but her hand felt a terrifying, entropic chill. He was being stretched across the sky, his soul becoming the very wind that was destroying the compound. Her uncle appeared at the entrance of the labyrinth, his face aged by a decade in a single night. "The price of protection is always the person you are protecting," he shouted over the roar of the cyclone. "You have kept him alive, but you have destroyed his being. He is now a ghost who hasn't had the mercy of dying." Nanda looked at the calabash, which was now vibrating so violently it was cracking the stone pedestal. The ink-like fluid was boiling, releasing a steam that smelled of old parchment and rain. She understood now that she couldn't keep him in this state. To keep him safe was to subject him to a perpetual state of agony, a fractured existence where he was neither here nor there, neither dead nor truly alive. The cost was also being extracted from Nanda herself. Her own voice was beginning to falter, her throat feeling as if it were filled with dry sand. The ritual was a closed loop. To keep Tala's voice in the calabash, it was drawing on the vocal energy of the one who sealed it. She realized with a start that she hadn't spoken a full sentence in hours. Every time she tried to cry out, her voice was sucked toward the gourd, reinforcing the seal. She was becoming the new vessel, her own identity being sacrificed to maintain the lie of his safety. The price of her architectural career, her reputation, and her brother's life was a total, silent surrender to the darkness she had tried to manage. She looked at the blueprints of her wind trap and saw them for what they really were, a tomb. She had used her genius to build a more efficient prison. The wind outside slammed a heavy eucalyptus branch against the stone wall, the impact sounding like a gavel. The trial was over. The price had been calculated, and it was more than she could ever pay. She had to choose: let the truth destroy her world, or let the silence destroy her brother. The choice was taken out of her hands when the modern world finally breached the highlands. 3 black SUVs, mud-streaked and battered, roared up to the compound gates, their headlights cutting through the violet gloom of the storm. The men who emerged were not the polite bureaucrats from the Douala lobby. They were specialists, carrying high-frequency jamming equipment and tactical weapons. They didn't care about the ancestors or the ritual. They saw a localized weather anomaly that was broadcasting state secrets, and they had come to decommission the source. Nanda watched from within the labyrinth as they set up a perimeter, their electronic devices chirping in the chaotic air. They were the physical manifestation of the silence she had tried to create, men whose entire profession was the erasure of the inconvenient. The wind reacted to their presence with a feral intensity. The cyclone widened, the edges of the vortex turning into a wall of debris that shredded the SUV's tires and sent the men diving for cover. It was a clash of 2 different kinds of power: the cold, calculated suppression of the state and the raw, ancient fury of a silenced lineage. Nanda stood over the calabash, her hands trembling as she held the ritual chisel. The men were closing in, using their jamming equipment to create a path through the wind. They were moving toward the labyrinth, their faces obscured by tactical masks. The wind defended her, a gust of air so sharp it cut through the ballistic vests of the lead agents, but it was a losing battle. The more the wind fought, the more Tala's form flickered and faded. He was the fuel for the storm, and he was running out. Nanda realized that if she didn't act, the men would simply destroy the calabash with an explosive or a high-frequency pulse, and Tala's voice would be lost forever, erased by the very people he had tried to expose. She saw the lead agent reach the entrance of her stone structure, his weapon leveled at her chest. "Give us the device, mademoiselle," he shouted, his voice electronically amplified. Nanda looked at the calabash, then at the shimmering void that was her brother. The breaking point wasn't just about the gourd. It was about the wall she had built around her own heart. She realized she couldn't save him, but she could finally let him speak. In the flickering light of the storm and the agent's tactical torches, Nanda did something the ritual had never accounted for. She began to speak into the calabash herself. She didn't use the incantations her uncle had taught her. She used the language of their childhood, a mixture of Bamileke and French, a private dialect of shared secrets and sibling loyalty. "Tala, I am trading with the wind," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar. "I gave you the silence to keep you here, but now I give you the air to let you go. I take the weight of the wax. I take the stain of the ink." She pressed her lips to the fleshy, pulsing surface of the gourd, feeling the heartbeat of her brother through her teeth. The agents froze as the air around Nanda began to glow with a blinding, white-hot intensity. She was negotiating with the ancestors, offering her own career, her own voice in the halls of power, as a substitute for the one she had stolen. She promised the wind that, if it took the truth to the ends of the earth, she would be the one to stand in the ruins of the aftermath. The wind suddenly stilled. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm, a vacuum of sound so absolute that the agents dropped their weapons, clutching their heads in agony. In that stillness, Nanda felt the seal of the calabash begin to dissolve, not from the outside but from the inside. The beeswax didn't melt, it evaporated, turning into a fine golden mist that smelled of mountain honey. The negotiation was accepted. The price was her silence, not Tala's. She felt a coldness spread through her own throat, a sudden heavy inability to form words, as if her vocal cords were being turned into stone. At the same time, she saw Tala's form begin to solidify. He wasn't the shimmering ghost anymore. He was becoming a man again, his skin regaining its color, his eyes regaining their spark. But he was looking at her with a profound, tragic sadness. He knew the trade she had made. He was being brought back into a world that was about to be set on fire by his own words, and he was losing the sister who had been his only anchor. The agents regained their footing, rushing toward the pedestal, but Nanda just smiled, a silent, defiant gesture. The architecture of wind had served its purpose. The baffles were no longer traps, they were launchers. The shattering of the calabash was not a loud event. It was a soft, melodic pop, like a bubble bursting in a quiet room, but the ripple effect was felt across the entire continent. As the gourd broke, it didn't spray shards of wood or flesh. It released a concentrated wave of sound, a physical wall of truth that swept through the labyrinth and out into the night. The agents were thrown backward, their equipment exploding in showers of sparks as the compressed data of Tala's voice bypassed their jammers and uploaded itself to every device within a 50-mile radius. In Douala, in Yaoundé, in the boardrooms of the powerful and the markets of the poor, phones began to scream. Radios, televisions, and even digital billboards suddenly broadcast the ledger, the recordings, and the testimony that Nanda had tried to hide. It was the shattering of the national silence, a catastrophic leak that couldn't be plugged. Tala's voice was no longer a secret, it was the atmosphere itself. As the voice filled the world, the physical man, Tala, collapsed onto the red dirt, finally whole, finally solid, but gasping for air as if he had just been born. Nanda reached for him, her hands finally finding the warm, familiar skin of her brother's arm. She tried to say his name, to tell him she was sorry, but no sound came out. Her throat was a hollow chamber, her voice gone, traded for the shockwave that was currently toppling the ministry. The agents, realizing they had failed, retreated to their SUVs, their mission made obsolete by the sheer scale of the digital and spiritual release. The architecture of wind Nanda had built began to crumble, the stones falling in a deliberate, rhythmic pattern that echoed the Bamileke funeral drums. The ritual was complete. The voice was returned to the world, but it had no place left in the body of the man who had found it. Tala looked at Nanda, tears streaming down his face, and he spoke, his voice clear, resonant, and filled with a power that shook the very ground. "I hear you, Nanda," he whispered. "I hear the silence you took from me." Months later, The dust had settled over the ruins of the government, but the wind in the highlands had never truly calmed. Tala was now the face of a new Cameroon, a leader born from the storm, his voice a constant presence in the national discourse. He had used the data to rebuild the country's foundations, just as Nanda had once built stadiums. But Nanda was gone from the public eye. She lived in the ancestral compound, a silent architect who designed buildings that were meant to be felt rather than seen. She no longer spoke. She moved through the world with a graceful, heavy quietness, her presence a living monument to the price of a secret. Every evening, she would sit on the same stone pedestal where the calabash had once rested, watching the palm fronds sway in the breeze. She didn't need to speak to her brother. She could hear him every time the wind moved through the eucalyptus trees. He was the air, and she was the earth that held it. The story of the woman who hid her brother's voice in a calabash became a modern Bamileke legend, a viral tale told in the sleek cafes of Douala and the thatched huts of the West. It was a warning and a promise that in the modern world the truth cannot be contained, only managed. The wind that remembers was the final legacy of their struggle, a localized weather pattern that would forever haunt the halls of power in Cameroon, whispering the names of the silenced whenever the air pressure dropped. Nanda looked out over the mountains, feeling the cool draft of the evening brush against her cheek like a phantom kiss. She had lost her voice, but she had gained a world that finally knew how to listen. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, she picked up a piece of charcoal and began to sketch a new design, a structure with no walls, only vents and chambers, a place where the wind could always find a way to be heard. Silence isn't a sanctuary, it's a storm waiting for a reason to break. Nanda learned that you can bury a voice, but you can't bury the truth. If you were her, would you break the seal? Drop a wind in the comments for the next chapter, and follow to see what happens when the air finally screams back.